So this is the second part now. This is nice and dry, and now we can start adding the flowers. So I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush now and start printing those flowers on. So mix up the colour, quite nice and strong now, so less water than before. And start painting those flowers on, looking at the photo so that you know how these petals go on, and look at where the highlights are that you've put on. Now you can see this is wet on dry, so what happens is the colour gets very sharp edges. You can see exactly where everything goes because it's not wet on the surface, so it just stays exactly where it is. Now as we get further down the flower we get more petals, and so they overlap and become one mass really. And this is where we go back to wet and wet. So I've got the colour coming down like this, and now I'm going to add some of the translucent grey to it whilst it's still wet to get that darker colour like that. And then I'll do that on each of the flowers. So same on mixing that colour up on this flower here. So this is where we're kind of almost printing with the brush here to get those petals at the top, and then painting them as we come down like this. And again, whilst it's wet in wet, just going to add some of that translucent grey like that to make that a little bit darker. Now I'm going to show you how to use a cotton bud. It's just a bit of fun, it's a different way of painting. You need to wet the cotton bud first and put it in the paints like this. And then I have a flower here. So again, printing, it just makes perfect shape for the flowers. It's a little bit different to the painted way. Again, if I want the dark, just add a little bit of that translucent grey in there. And there we have it. And then I'm just going to use the credit card to scrape a bit of a stalk in. And this time the colour is being pulled out because obviously the colour underneath is dry, so it's not going to do this scraping out technique, but it does what we call a pulling out technique, so it's bringing that colour down whilst it's still wet. Just keep going up there as well. Right, so just do another one of those cotton bud ones. This colour again needs to be nice and wet in order to do that. And maybe another flower, just sorting out, there's a stalk there, so I need to put that on there to make that make sense. So it gives a little bit of a softer feel, so I'm using this for the flowers in the background there. A little bit of the translucent grey. Don't want to lose that stalk, so I'm being a bit careful there. Excuse me. And another one on here. And then I'm going to go back to using my brush, mixing that intense violet again, and then just going to paint these on here. Again, I need to be careful where the highlights are. You need to make sure that those are actually part of the petals that you're painting, otherwise it won't make sense. See how that translucent grey is just going into that wet violet there, purple there even. And then another one up here. I've actually lost that one in the distance now, unfortunately, because it's behind this one, so that wasn't very good planning. So it's starting to come about. These flowers here do look much more in focus because they're wet on dry. That's soft focus where they're wet and wet, and then these really show up. Notice how I'm leaving gaps of colour. That's a nice technique to use. It gives a more painterly look. And one more here. This got a little bit blurry, but I've got the sharp focus of the masking fluid on there, so I definitely need to add a flower here. And a little bit more of translucent grey. And then I've got a stalk here. Do be careful with this. If you've got a stalk, you need a flower, otherwise it's not going to lead anywhere and look a bit odd. So I'm going to add another flower there. This one hasn't got any highlights on. And there, so we've got those flowers, they're all in focus. We've got the soft focus ones in the background. I've done a bit of splattering there, almost by accident. So the next thing is the butterfly. Now, as I was saying, this mask away rubber is fantastic for getting rid of the masking fluid. It's much easier than using your finger, especially in the summer. Get oil on your fingertips, and then it's quite difficult to get rid of it. So I'm just going to rub this away gently like that. I'm not going to do the flowers yet because, as you can see, it's still wet, so that's no good. You need to take this off when it's super dry, but I haven't touched this since I dried it, so it's very, very dry. And then hopefully the flowers will dry in time for me to get rid of the masking fluid on there. Masking fluid can be problematic. My masking fluid had got a little bit thick because of the heat that we've had recently with all the sun and everything. So it's best to shake it up when it gets like that and just check it out first. Always practice first before you do it on the main painting. Right, so now it's rigger time. So this isn't a normal rigger, this is Matthew Palmer branch and detail brush, and I really like this. It's very stiff, so it's easier to use than the ordinary rigger. Now if we look at the photograph, you can see the detail on the butterfly here, all the shadows and everything. There is a wing coming round here, and it's quite tricky to see where that starts and this one finishes or whatever. So what I'm going to do is add a bit more of a shadow on there. The dots are important, this shadow, and then all these lines coming up radially into the butterfly. So have paper towel handy so you can keep drying the brush. I'm just going to have the colour here. And I'm going to use translucent grey first of all to get the shape of that wing coming around like this. So this is the shadow I was talking about. A little bit of translucent grey, a little bit of the intense purple. Got a dot there. And maybe a little bit of the cobalt as well. Cobalt is a really nice warm blue. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a wet and wet just to let that blend a bit. And then using the translucent grey to get some lines across here. It's a little bit tricky because these flowers are wet. I'm trying to do it so that you can see what I'm doing. So just some main lines coming up like that, and then some from here as well. So you can get some very fine lines indeed with a rigger. So it's a perfect brush for this. Radially coming up from the edge of the wing, keep calling it petal, and across like that. And then there's a bit of a shadow on the middle one, kind of a bit here, and I'm using the intense violet now to put that shadow on. So it's a mixture. You've got the translucent grey and then a bit of the purple as well. And to add a little bit more of translucent grey in there, make it a little bit darker. And really look at the photograph to see where those lines go. So we have some coming across like that as well. I'm just going to add a little bit of the purple to the body here, just a little bit, very light colour. I'm going to dab that because it's got a bit wet, so let's try again. Dab it off on the paper towel like this and then apply it. Still too wet. Dab it. So dab the colour really well on there. That's a bit dark, so like that. And then apply that colour, that's a bit better. So it's nice and light, it still stands out against the dark background. So like anything, it's worth practicing these techniques before you actually apply them. Now I'm going to get some very dark colour here and just mixing up the translucent grey with water, but nice and dark like that. And this is so that I can add these markings here and here. So we've got two on there. And then the other one is a mark here. So it's really important that that is dry before you put that colour on, because you want that marking to stand out really. So that's a wet on dry, and that's what this is all about, wet and wet and wet on dry, and when to do that. Okay, so the next thing is, once these are dry, is to just take this off. Now this is actually a little bit wet in places. I'm just going to dab it here. Ideally wait until it's completely dry before taking these off, but if I do this you can see that's dry, so that's working. So I've got some nice highlights. It just makes it stand out a bit where the sun's been shining on it. I'm just going to be a bit careful here because it's still a bit wet. There we go. And here. The photograph I've been using, by the way, is from Pixabay. And Pixabay photographs are actually, you are allowed to use them. But do be careful with photos that you're using, especially if you are thinking of selling your work. You should not sell work that is copied from another artist, or photographs as well. You know, that's what this is. Right, so there we go. We've got some highlights on the lavender. So a simple cabbage white butterfly in the lavender fields, wet in wet, wet on dry. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, if you could share it. Thanks for watching.